Today I'm going to show you the old-fashioned and easy way to make and can homemade apple cider, and it does not require an apple press, so come along and I'll show you. And right here is the recipe if you want to screenshot it, or of course I will have it all listed in the description below. Start by rinsing off those apples. First, all we're going to do is cut up each of these apples and take the core out and then put them into a big stock pot. Once I cut up all the apples, I also like to get the cores back out and cut off the tops and the bottoms of the cores just so that we use every piece of apple possible. And we're done cutting it up. And as you can tell, all I'm left with is the very center of the apple that contains the seed, so there's very little waste. Now it's time to add in our sweetener and our 4 spices. I prefer to use maple syrup, but you can also use sugar or honey. And if you want it to be a sugar-free apple cider, that's totally fine. You don't have to put any sweetener in it. It's not required for it to be canned, but I do like it to have that little bit of sweetness in it, and I'm telling you, putting the maple syrup in it gives it such a good flavor. The original recipe calls for 1 cup of maple syrup or sugar, but I prefer to use a half a cup. I just feel like this one's too sweet. If you want it sweeter, that's fine. You can always add more sugar or maple syrup later. So then for our spices, we're going to do 2 tablespoons of ground cinnamon, 2 tablespoons of ground cloves, a half a teaspoon of ground allspice, and a half a teaspoon of ground nutmeg. Let's add all that into our pot. For reference, I like a really spicy apple cider with a lot of flavor. So if you don't like a lot of spice, I would cut all of these spices in half. When you're done making the apple cider at the end, if it doesn't have enough spice, you can always add more to it, but it's impossible to get that spice out if you think it's too spicy. And it's done. So now we're gonna take it over to our stovetop. This already smells amazing. Now we're just gonna fill our pot with water, and you don't have to measure this. All you're gonna do is fill the pot up until it's 2 inches above the level of the apples. And it's done. Now, obviously the apples do float, so it does kind of help if before you put the water in, you just kind of eyeball where the 2-inch level is above the apples. So now we're just gonna give it a good mix and bring it to a boil. We are boiling, so now we're gonna cover and simmer this for about 2 hours. Make sure you give it a good stir about every 20 minutes, that way the same apples aren't sitting at the top the whole time. Okay, it has been an hour and a half, and look at this. See how the water in there has become very brown and all of our apples are mushy and cooked? So now I'm just gonna go through and just kind of mash up a few of them. This is hard to do one-handed, and it's a lot easier to do with a potato masher, but I can't find it. So I just try to mash up a little bit of it just to make sure we're getting all of the juice out of those apples and the flavor out of those apples into our water. Okay, so I just spent about 2 minutes using my spoon just to mash up a lot of the apples. So you can see that here. So now I'm gonna cover it up and just simmer for 30 more minutes. Okay, so it's officially been 2 hours total. And you can see this. Look at that beautiful brown caramel color. And it smells so good. So now all we need to do is strain out all of the apples. And we're gonna do that by putting it through this little system. And it's really simple stuff. This is just a cheesecloth that I have wet. It always works better if it's wet first. So I just rinse it off and wring it out. And then underneath that is just a metal mesh colander, which is over top of a big pot. So I'm just gonna pour this in there. Now remember, this is really hot, so be careful. Here it is. Now I'm just gonna let it cool down for about an hour until it's cool to touch, because what I'm gonna do is take my cheesecloth and hold it up like this, and then I'll squeeze out with my hands all of the moisture and goodness that is left in this. I don't wanna leave any apple cider behind. While we wait for that to cool down, we're gonna go ahead and sterilize our jars. I just rinse off my clean jars, put them in an oven at 250, bake them for 10 minutes, and they're ready to go. And I sterilize those lids by putting them in a small pot of water, bring it to a boil. Once it's boiling, you can shut it off, they're ready to go. All right, this is cooled down and ready to squeeze out. So I'm gonna go ahead and get our stock pot of water ready. I just fill it up with water and bring it to a boil. Look at that. Let's go ahead and strain out whatever liquid is left inside. And there it is. Look at this beautiful, delicious apple cider. So now I'm just bringing it back to a boil, and then we can fill our jars. This is also where you'll taste test it. So if you taste it and it needs more sweetener, this is where you can add it. You can also add more spices, whatever you want. Taste test. So good. And do not waste your cooked apples. If you blend this up, it makes the most delicious apple cider flavored applesauce. All right, just brought it back to a boil, so now we're gonna go ahead and fill our jars, leaving a 1/2 inch of headspace. After you fill those jars, wipe your rims with a wet rag, then add your lids and your bands to fingertip tight. And I got the jars loaded in. So now, as a reminder, if you put the jars in and it stops boiling, that's okay. Just make sure it comes back to a boil before you start your timer. And the timer's up. Let's go ahead and take them out. And they're done. That's it. It's so easy and it's absolutely delicious. Of course, let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Otherwise, just another thing, I've been using these 4 jars lids for over a year now. I've canned hundreds of jars in these lids and I really like them. They have a really nice rubber ring that's really thick. I've had every single one seal and no problem. So I'll have the link to those lids in the description if you want it. Otherwise, make yourself some apple cider because this stuff is amazing. Happy homesteading!